the biggest story in the country right before the Virginia gubernatorial election was the battle between parents and school boards. And you'll recall that the DOJ basically acceded to a request from the National School Boards Union, the National School Boards Association, to start looking into people who are upset with school boards as potential domestic terrorists. There's a letter sent from the NSBA to the FBI and the DOJ asking them to treat people who are criticizing school boards overtly and voraciously, to treat them as though they were domestic terrorists. They tried to invoke the Patriot Act. And you will remember that Merrick Garland was brought before a Senate committee, and he was asked about surveilling parents and checking into parents, and was the DOJ going after parents for the great crime of being angry at their school boards? And here's what Merrick Garland had to say.
What does the National Security Division have to do with parents at school boards?
This is not, again, about parents at school boards. This is about threats of violence.
Yeah. Section 223. Yeah. That statute covers the use of not just telephones, but telecommunications devices to annoy someone. So are you going to sic your U.S. attorneys and the FBI on a parents group if they post on Facebook something that annoys a school board member, Judge?
The answer to that is no.
So they're not going to do that, right? They're definitely not going to track people's communications. They're not going to spend their time doing this. Okay, so now, according to the Wall Street Journal, breaking story, FBI tracks threats against teachers, school board members. Quote, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has set up a process to track threats against school board members and teachers, moving to implement a Justice Department directive that some law enforcement officials and Republican lawmakers say could improperly target parents protesting local education policies. The heads of the FBI criminal and counterterrorism divisions instructed agents in an October 20th memo to flag all assessments and investigations into potentially criminal threats and harassment and intimidation of educators with a threat tag, which officials said would allow them to evaluate the scope of the problem. The internal email asks FBI agents to consider the motivation behind any criminal threat and whether it potentially violates federal law. Agents should tag such threats. Edu officials should better track them, according to the memo, which was reviewed by the Wall Street Journal. Okay, and the story continues. The purpose of the threat tag is to help scope this threat on a national level and provide an opportunity for comprehensive analysis of the threat picture for effective engagement with law enforcement partners at all levels, says the email signed by the FBI's Assistant Director for Counterterrorism. An FBI agent provided a copy of the internal email to several Republican lawmakers, citing concerns it could open the door for the Bureau to collect information on parents voicing their opposition to local school policies during meetings. The FBI said Tuesday in a statement, the FBI has never been in the business of investigating parents who speak out or policing speech at school board meetings, and we are not going to start now. We are fully committed to preserving and protecting First Amendment rights, including freedom of speech. The new procedures were prompted by an October 4th memo from AG Merrick Garland, ordering the FBI to help local leaders address threats to school personnel, a move he has said was aimed at stopping violence against teachers and school staff over politically charged issues. Now, the question, of course, is why that's not a local law enforcement issue. If somebody issues a threat against me, I report it to local law enforcement. That we get threats all the time. They're reported to local law enforcement. That is not an FBI issue. Why is the FBI investigating this? The reason the FBI is doing it is at the behest of the NSBA. The FBI, in its statement, described a threat tag as a tool to compile statistics and track information about a range of issues. The creation of a threat tag in no way changes the long-standing requirements for opening an investigation, nor does it represent a shift in how the FBI prioritizes threats, said the statement. Garland said during a congressional hearing last month that while he didn't have a full accounting of such threats nationwide, complaints from school board officials and news reports show that the problem is becoming more prevalent. Now, again, the question becomes, he was asked specifically, do you know of a serious uptick in death threats? And he said, no, I really don't have evidence of that. We just have kind of news reports. Why this merits a federal investigation and a publicly stated federal investigation is sort of beyond me. The other problem, of course, is that your trust in the FBI has been somewhat shaken over the past few years, given the fact that the FBI initiated an entire investigation against Carter Page based on the Clinton campaign just making up crap about Donald Trump and then handing it over to the FBI. And that eventually would be mainstreamed into the Steele dossier, which would be mainstreamed into the media, which would be mainlined into the Mueller report. So yeah, my trust in institutional law enforcement to look into quote-unquote threats by parents, I am skeptical, to say the least. Some Republicans say the Justice Department is thrusting the FBI into what is usually considered a local issue. They say the tactics are an effort to silence parents who speak out at school board meetings about topics such as mask mandates and how race is addressed in schools. The AG issued his directive shortly after the NSBA asked President Biden in a letter for federal help in dealing with threats by people opposed to face mask mandates for stemming COVID-19 and to the teaching of critical race theory. The association has since apologized for the letter, which suggested that the DOJ treat attacks and threats against public school officials as hate crimes or domestic terrorism. A spokesman for the group didn't immediately respond to requests for comment on Tuesday. At a House Intelligence Subcommittee hearing earlier this month, several Republican lawmakers pressed the FBI on the new directive. Does the FBI consider parents domestic terrorists? Said Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, to which the FBI representative said no, quoting, as long as individuals are not committing federal violations, force, or violence in promoting an ideology, they would not be. Okay, but that October 20th email suggests a broad-based concern by the FBI with parental feedback aimed at school boards. According to Javed Ali, who teaches at University of Michigan, the FBI will have to tread very carefully. They can't open investigations into people showing up and protesting. When someone crosses the line of direct threats of violence, whether in the physical domain or virtually, that is crime. But the question is, why is the FBI involved in this at all? And why are they publicly announcing that they are involved in this other than to attempt to quash people suggesting criticism of public school officials? And here's the thing. Your public school officials, and it seems to be true across a wide variety of states, public school officials are very often directly at odds with parents. They are enabling and effectuating policy that is rooted in radical ideas about gender, about race in the United States. And parents have every right to be pissed off. Parents have every right to radically transparent oversight of these school boards. When you delegate your kids to the public schools, you are not saying that the public schools get to educate your kid in whatever the public schools see fit. You are saying that your educational priorities ought to be put into what the schools teach your kids. Okay, that you are delegating. Okay, you are reserving the right to educate your kids, but you are delegating that right to the schools with the understanding that they are then not going to indoctrinate your children in a bunch of radical garbage. And yet that is precisely what our public schools are doing across the nation. I'll get to some of those stories in a second, because this scares the living hell out of me, and it should scare the living hell out of you. Okay, because the public schools are still churning out the majority of students in this country. They are affecting how families operate. They're affecting how families are able to teach their values to their children. It's why we need school vouchers across this country as fast as humanly possible. Every parent, not just the wealthy, should have the ability to take their kids out of the local public school and put their kid into a school that reflects their values. It is imperative at this point. And there has to be a radical shift in how these school boards operate. And if the school boards don't want people taking money out of the public schools and putting their kids in private schools, maybe they ought to start reflecting the priorities of the parental communities that they actually are supposed to serve. Here are some of the stories that are creating alarm among parents. And they should be creating alarm among parents. And they are from all over the country. So this one from Brittany Bernstein over at National Review, reporting on the situation in West Hartford, Connecticut. Quote, elementary school students in West Hartford, Connecticut public schools are being forced to undergo social emotional learning through an equity lens, as district officials have reportedly told parents they may not opt out of the curriculum, which aims to teach students a set of social justice standards. Parents from the district contacted the nonprofit Parents Defending Education to share concerns over material being used to teach elementary students about group identities, including transgender content being taught to kindergarten students. One parent raised a red flag about When Aiden Became a Brother, a book being taught to fourth grade students that the parent described as full-on gender theory, which is teaching students that the sex you're assigned at birth is wrong. The description of the book reads, when Aiden was born, everyone thought he was a girl. His parents gave him a pretty name. His room looked like a girl's room. He wore clothes that other girls liked wearing. After he realized he was a trans boy, Aiden and his family fixed the parts of his life that didn't fit anymore, and he settled happily into his new life. When Aiden's parents announced they're having a second child, Aiden wants to do everything he can to make things right for his new sibling from the beginning, including choosing the best name and picking out the right decor and clothes. The book asks what making things right actually means. Another fourth grade mentor texted a book about pronouns called They, She, He, Me, Free to Be. The lessons are supposed to teach students in kindergarten about social justice standards, including identity, diversity, justice, and action. The identity standard includes texts that teach students about transgender people and the use of preferred pronouns, including the inclusive singular they. A mentor text for kindergartner students is Introducing Teddy, which tells a story about a character and his Teddy, Thomas. Thomas says, I've always known that I'm a girl Teddy, not a boy Teddy. I wish my name was Tilly, not Thomas. Another text for the kindergarten age group is Let's Talk About Race. Meanwhile, a first grade text includes Jacob's New Dress, a story about a boy who wants to wear a dress to school, and Are You a Boy or Are You a Girl? A book about a character who prefers not to tell other children whether they are a boy or a girl. Third graders are reading a similar book called 10,000 Dresses, about a boy named Bailey who dreams of magical dresses, but people in his life tell him he should not be thinking about dresses because he is a boy. But later he begins making dresses with a new friend. Fifth graders read I Am Jazz and It Feels Good to Be Yourself, which says, quote, some people are boys, some people are girls, some people are both, neither, or somewhere in between. In an email to parents, the district's director of equity advancement, Dr. Rosina Haskins, explains that the schools have, quote, redoubled district-wide efforts to attend to the social and emotional needs of children and adults. It explains that the aforementioned social justice standards come from the framework of the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Haskins writes that the group acknowledges that while SEL alone will not solve long-standing and deep-seated inequities in the education system, it can help schools promote understanding, examine biases, reflect on and address the impact of racism, close opportunity gaps, and create a more inclusive school community. So we are now indoctrinating kindergartners in Connecticut in the idea that boys and girls are malleable categories and that a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy, because there is nothing that is healthier for a child than confusing them about their gender. Let me just explain something about children. I have 3. They're 7, 5, and 1. If anybody approached my kids and started telling them about how they might be a member of the opposite sex, that person would be out of my house so fast it would make your head swim. This is predatory behavior upon children. Confusing children about their sex is disgusting. It's disgusting. Gender dysphoria is an actual condition. It is not a cute little thing that ought to be promulgated to tens of millions of school children across the United States. Gender dysphoria is an actual mental disorder according to the DSM-5. Pretending that mental disorder is a somehow referendum on the notion that there are binary sexes in life, or that your child should be taught about the supposed malleability of sex contra all science and evidence, is a way for you to prey on children. It's a way for you to screw up kids who are not suffering from gender dysphoria. The belief that in service to kids who have gender dysphoria, you have to screw up an entire generation of children by telling them that inborn biological characteristics are of no consequence whatsoever it's vile, and parents should be standing up to it at every single level. It is not merely Connecticut public schools that are now teaching this sort of crap. According to the New York Post, a New Hampshire teenager is suing his school district after he was allegedly suspended from athletics for saying there are only 2 genders. The Exeter High School freshman said in the suit he was hit with a 1-game football suspension in September stemming from a text conversation he had with another student off school grounds. The lawsuit was filed November 4th through an attorney with the Christian organization Cornerstone Action with the claim that he stated a Catholic-based belief that there are only male and female genders. By the way, that's not a Catholic-based belief. That's reality. Okay, because either gender is a complete spectrum in which there are an infinite number of genders, or there is a male gender and a female gender. And you can sometimes have characteristics of one or the other while being a biological male. So you can be an effeminate male, or you can be a very masculine female. But that does not change the fact that male and female are categories that exist. The kid's lawsuit also claims Exeter's policy on non-binary gender identity and pronouns infringes on his First Amendment rights. The policy says students have a right to be addressed by a name and pronoun of their choosing, related to their gender identities, and also says those who don't recognize others' gender identities or pronouns are violating the policy. The student was suspended for denying that people can belong to a gender other than that of male or female. The student, it goes on, will never refer to any individual person using plural pronouns such as they, using contrived pronouns such as she, or with any similar terminology that reflects values the student does not share. The suspension came after the student had been engaged in a conversation on the bus over gender with friends over the perceived difficulty in using plural pronouns for an individual in Spanish, which uses masculine and feminine plurals. A female student overheard the discussion, allegedly told the student there were more than 2 genders. No, there aren't. There's only 2 genders, the student allegedly replied. That conversation continued in contentious text exchange, which was shown to him by school administrators in printed form when he was suspended. So, students now being suspended for the great crime of pointing out the reality, which is that male and female are categories that exist. Meanwhile, in Florida, according to Breitbart.com, parents of a 13-year-old daughter have filed a federal lawsuit against a Florida school district after officials at Deer Lake Middle School secretly transitioned her into a transgender male, or a biological girl who says she wants to live as a boy, including allowing her to use male spaces like bathrooms and choosing pronouns. And this, of course, is the scariest and most insane thing. that is happening at our nation's public schools. Not just happening in the public schools, by the way. It's happening in the medical context as well. Abigail Schreier reported on this case in Washington State where there was a kid who was suicidal, happened to be autistic, was put on 72-hour suicide watch. And in the process of that suicide watch, the administrators at this facility convinced the kid, basically, that he was a member of the opposite gender and then told the parents that unless they started transition processes, the kid would not be released back to them. The parents took the kid, moved out of state. The kid is still living as his biological sex. Happily, not in the state of Washington. Okay, now we're seeing this happen in public schools. Jeffrey and January Littlejohn's daughter, who is referred to as AG in court filings, did talk about her gender confusion with her mother, who holds a master's degree in counseling from Florida State University. January spoke at a gathering of the Florida Family Policy Council about the school withholding from her and her husband what the school did without their knowledge or permission. She said, when our daughter told us she was experienced stress about her gender at the height of the pandemic, we were completely caught by surprise. She had expressed no signs of gender confusion or distress in early childhood or leading up to this announcement. So we were trying our best to navigate these uncharted waters and support her in the best way we could and help her through her feelings. We found a counselor, started our own research, which led us to gender ideology. Apparently, according to a lawsuit filed by the parents, this is the Washington Examiner now, the lawsuit says the Littlejohns informed their daughter's math teacher, Rima Kelly, about their teenager's gender dysphoria and continued treatment with a mental health counselor. Kelly offered to inform the school about their daughter's desire to identify as non-binary. The parents declined. A couple of weeks later, while she was getting into the car, the Littlejohn's daughter mentioned the school had asked her which bathroom she wanted to use, which the lawsuit says she thought was funny. January Littlejohn told the Washington Examiner that was the first time she became aware that the school was meeting with her daughter, assisting the teenager in embracing a different gender identity in school settings. The school claimed the child needed to authorize for her parents to be at the meeting. So in other words, according to the school, if the kid didn't authorize the parents could not be at the meeting. So just to get this straight, in public schools, you cannot give a Band-Aid or an Advil to a child without parental permission. But if the kid comes in and says, I'm a member of the opposite gender, the parents are not allowed to know about it, according to many of these schools, unless the kid gives permission. The Littlejohn's attorney, Bernadette Broyles, of a nonprofit law firm called the Child and Parental Rights Campaign, said the school could not provide the text the law officials referred to. The Examiner reported the lawsuit says the school district was relying upon LCS Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Gender Nonconforming, and Questioning Support Guide, which expressly directs school administrators to avoid notifying the child's parents about a child's gender identity, claiming such an action could lead to the student becoming homeless. In other words, the school cares more about the kid than the parents do, which is the big lie that you're constantly told by left-wing public school officials. We care more about your kids than you do. Yeah, screw you. You don't. You don't. I guarantee you, parents care more about their kids, on average, than school administrators do. And the belief that school administrators have any level of expertise navigating gender dysphoria is insane. It's also insane that all of these public interest groups on behalf of radical gender ideology are the ones writing the guides for the schools. That's totally crazy. So you have a left-wing organization like GLAAD writing the policy prescriptions for how to treat kids who are gender confused at the age of 8. Insane. And non-reflective of what parents actually want. I know what you're thinking. It's time to binge some more Ben Shapiro videos. Well, you are right. You should. But first, like and subscribe. Perfect. I'll see you in the next video.